Okay, so in this lecture I want to talk a bit about putting arguments in standard form. And putting arguments in standard form, or distilling arguments, will honestly be our first real step in evaluating arguments, our first real step in seeing what the structure of an argument is. It's honestly the first thing we need to do, and it's often pretty helpful in seeing what the structure of the argument is and whether or not that structure is a good one. So what you do when you put an argument in standard form is you find the premises and the conclusion, or conclusions. Sometimes arguments will have more than one conclusion. Relatively rare, but it does happen. And you put it in a numbered form with the premises at, put them first, and at the very end, the conclusion. And you guys might be asking right now, well, does it matter what order we put the premises in? And my answer is yes, but don't worry about that right now. We'll talk about why it matters and how to do it later. For now, I just want you to see this idea of breaking the argument down into numbered premises with the conclusion at the end. And so the first thing, honestly, the first thing you always want to do when you evaluate an argument is, in a sense, work backwards. Find the conclusion and then work from there. And now look, in well-written arguments, the conclusion will be either at the beginning, somewhere toward the beginning, or at the end or toward the end, right? Often, and you'll see this often in good writing, you'll have the conclusion in one form at the beginning and another form at the end, just to remind you what it is, right? Unfortunately, not every bit of writing you read is good writing, right? There are plenty of bad writers in the world. And so unfortunately, sometimes the conclusion will be buried in the middle of an argument somewhere, right? I'll try not to give you any arguments where that's the case, but just keep in mind that might happen. Some people are bad writers. Some people expect their readers to do their work for them. When you write stuff for other classes, don't be that person, but just some people are that person, right? All right. So let's start with a simple argument. Sorry, I had it in the last slide. Abortion is not morally wrong. If it were morally wrong, it would be illegal, and it's not illegal. This is not a great argument. I don't know that legal and immoral, moral and legal, really line up. But let's just start with this not incredibly great argument. What is the conclusion of this argument? What is the statement the other statements are trying to give reasons for? Well, conclusions in red here, right? Abortion is not morally wrong. What are our premises? Well, they're in blue. They're the other two statements. If it were morally wrong, it would be illegal, and it's not illegal, right? If abortion were morally wrong, it would be illegal. It's not illegal, so it's not morally wrong. Here's another simple argument. This one's a better argument. It actually does establish its conclusion. Pretty trivial conclusion. I don't know why anybody would need to make this argument, but just giving it to you an example, right? President of the U.S. is a federal employee. Since Joe Biden is president, he is a federal employee. What is our conclusion? Our conclusion is Joe Biden is a federal employee, right? Premises, President of the U.S. is a federal employee. Joe Biden is president. Here we see it again. He's a federal employee. Conclusion, he's president. President's a federal employee. Our premises. President of the U.S. is a federal employee. Premise 1, Joe Biden is the president. Therefore, Biden is a federal employee. Now, the two arguments I've given you guys so far are just very easy ones to, illustrate this idea. But the real world arguments are often a bit more complicated. You often have to do a little bit more. And one thing you often have to do is when distilling an argument or putting it in standard form, remember those terms are interchangeable, they mean the same thing, you need to get rid of all rhetoric, right? Remember, I told you guys, ignore rhetoric. Rhetoric is not what we're concerned about. We're only concerned with reasons for the claim. So before you even start to distill an argument, put it in standard form, it's probably a good idea to go through and just put a line through any rhetoric. Put a big red line through it. I mean, or a line through it, right? You don't have to go buy a red pen just to do that, but just mark it out, just ignore it. So here's an example of an argument, well, of a passage that has some argument. It also has some rhetoric, right? Despite what the tinfoil hat crowd might think, the Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. If it were a conspiracy, there would be some hard evidence of such a conspiracy. There isn't. One can only pity all those people who are so dumb as to believe things without good evidence, right? Well, what's our rhetoric here? Well, this stuff about the tinfoil hat crowd is obviously rhetoric, right? You know, this one can only pity, you know, that's also rhetoric. I've put it in red here, but you know, if you saw this and you were putting this argument in standard form, I just put a line through it, get rid of it, right? So what we have left here is the actual argument now that we've gotten rid of the rhetoric. Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. If it were a conspiracy, there would be some hard evidence of such a conspiracy, but there isn't. Well, what's our conclusion? Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. The other statements are our premises, right? If the Kennedy assassination were a conspiracy, there would be some hard evidence of such a conspiracy. There is no hard evidence of a conspiracy, so the Kennedy assassination was not a conspiracy. One other thing you have to deal with when putting arguments in standard form or distilling them, and you guys should think about, you know, why might we call this distilling? Well, you know, distilling, if you're familiar with the process, is boiling something down. You know, we are boiling our arguments down. We're boiling the junk out of them, right? Part of the junk we boil out is the rhetoric. The other junk we boil out is, well, arguments are often repetitive, right? People repeat themselves. You know, and in a long argument, there's reason to do this, right? You might let the reader know what the conclusion is at the beginning and at the end, just so it's very clear, right? In long pieces, you might also repeat premises just so people remember them. Sometimes people do this because they're bad writers, though, or they just want to beat you over the head, right? Some people think, well, if I repeat it often enough, they'll accept it. Either way, premises and conclusions are sometimes repeated. You only need to say them once. So if you find a premise or a conclusion repeated, you should condense it. You know, and by condense, I mean you should either do one of two things. You should either just take one statement of it and throw out the other one, decide which of them states it the best, or sometimes you might want to combine the two. You might say, well, these two sentences say the same thing, and here's a sentence that captures what both say, right? We'll practice more with this so you'll get better at it. It'll be clear what you should do. Here's an example of an argument that is repetitive. Inflation isn't going anywhere anytime soon. For one thing, the supply chain issues that are driving much of the current inflation are not likely to be resolved in the near future. In fact, supply chain wars will get worse if there is another major COVID wave in the US, Asia, or Europe, and there is a good chance there will be another wave in at least one of those places. Finally, the Russia-Ukraine war will push inflation higher as long as it goes on. The supply chain will not improve quickly. COVID is still out there, and the Russia-Ukraine war will drive up inflation, all of which means that inflation is here to stay for the next few months or even years. Now notice what these last sentences from the supply chain all the way to for the next few months or even years, one of these sentences basically just recaps all the premises, the other just restates the conclusion. I've put it in yellow here. You know, to distill this argument, you just get rid of these or combine them with the other statements. You know, you don't need to repeat yourself. You shouldn't repeat yourself in an argument, right? So this is the argument put into standard form or distilled. The supply chain issues that are driving much of the current inflation are not likely to be resolved in the near future. Supply chain issues will get worse if there's another major COVID wave in the US, Asia, or Europe. There's a good chance there will be another COVID wave in another COVID wave in one of those places. The Russia-Ukraine war will push inflation higher as long as it goes on. Inflation will not go away anytime soon. Now we've gotten rid of the repetitive stuff. We want to get rid of that. So some arguments will have both rhetoric and be repetitive. For those, you're going to get rid of a lot. Distilling, you will boil those arguments down quite a bit, right? And you'll be surprised how much goes away when you distill an argument. Sometimes an argument that's like 7 or 8 pages will take up a page once you've distilled it. All right, so hopefully the basic idea there is clear. You guys don't have to be like, old hands at this. You don't have to be wonderful. You don't have to be able to distill any argument you might come across yet. We are going to practice that in class a lot. But I just want y'all to get the basic idea here, and hopefully that's pretty clear to you. If it's not, send me an email or definitely ask me in class. Asking me in class would probably be better since I can go over it, since if it's not clear to you, it's probably not clear to some other people as well.